Schizophrenia. If you talk to God, you are praying. If God talks to you, you have schizophrenia. When a man says he is Jesus, he is not complaining, he is boasting. We consider his claim a symptom of illness. He considers it a stamp of greatness. When a man says he is Jesus or makes some other claim that seems to us outrageous, we call him psychotic and lock him up in the madhouse. Freedom of speech is only for normal people. If you believe that you are Jesus, or that the communists are after you, and they are not, then your belief is likely to be regarded as a symptom of schizophrenia. But if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, or that communism is the only scientifically and morally correct form of government, then your belief is likely to be regarded as a reflection of who you are, Christian or communist. This is why I think that we will discover the chemical cause of schizophrenia when we discover the chemical cause of Christianity and communism. No sooner and no later. Psychiatrists look for defective genes and twisted molecules as the causes of schizophrenia, because schizophrenia is the name of a disease. If Christianity or communism were called diseases, would psychiatrists look for their chemical and genetic causes? Schizophrenia is 1. The cancer of conceit, 2. Early retirement from life, 3. Being never available to anyone, 4. The psychiatrist's professionally legitimized lies about the patient. Schizophrenia is a declaration, not a disease. What does the subject assert? A conceited capitulation. I won't struggle for the rewards the world has to offer. I refuse to lower myself and get down into the dirt of everyday life. I am too good for that. When it was invented in 1911, schizophrenia was said to be incurable. Since then, it has allegedly been cured with insulin coma, metrazole shock, electric shock, lobotomy, and neuroleptic drugs. In 1988, still another cure was announced, the transplantation of embryonic brain tissue into the brain of the schizophrenic patient. This emperor, as I have remarked elsewhere, has so many beautiful robes that it is unthinkable that he should not exist. Schizophrenia, psychiatrists maintain, is a thought disturbance. By the same token, one could say that heresy is a belief disturbance. In each case, the question is, who is disturbed? If the subject himself, he is free to seek relief for his disturbance. If others, disturbed by the schizophrenic heretic, they are free to seek relief for their disturbance. My aim with respect to the political and social situation of the schizophrenic, mental patient, has simply been to extend to him the same protection from psychiatric persecution which is guaranteed to the heretic, religious dissenter or deviant, from religious persecution. The real object of the First Amendment, declared Justice Joseph Story, was not to countenance, much less advance, Mahometanism or Judaism or infidelity, but to exclude all rivalry among Christian sects. It thus cuts off the means of religious persecution, the vice and pest of former ages, and of the subversion of the rights of conscience in matters of religion. Similarly, the object of extending the protections of the First Amendment to beliefs now categorized as psychiatric is not to countenance, much less advance, crazy or delusional beliefs, but to exclude all rivalry with respect to what constitutes rationality among religious, psychiatric, and other systems of beliefs. This would cut off the means of psychiatric persecution, the vice and pest of the age of reason, and of the subversion of the rights of conscience in matters of psychiatry. From testimony given at the trial of John W. Hinckley, Jr., William T. Carpenter, professor of psychiatry at the University of Maryland, Hinckley suffers from process schizophrenia, G7, 1982. Park E. Dietz, M.D., professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, Hinckley does not suffer from schizophrenia, June 7, 1982. David M. Baer, assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, CAT scans were absolutely essential to my diagnosis of schizophrenia, May 21, 1982. David Davis, M.D., professor of radiology at George Washington University Medical Center, there is no possible way that you can predict people's behavior or whether they are schizophrenic or not schizophrenic from a CAT scan, period, June 3, 1982. The lover and the schizophrenic display opposite dispositions. The lover is attached, intimate, passionate, and longs for the other, whereas the schizophrenic is detached, lonely, aloof, and is uninterested in the other. This is consistent with the fact that everyone loves a lover, and we consider such a person to be especially fortunate, whereas everyone hates a schizophrenic, and we consider such a person to be especially unfortunate. Some schizophrenic speech is simply a form of idle chatter. Clearly, the patient does not take his own utterances seriously. He merely makes noise, perhaps to distract himself. From what? His insignificance? Shallowness? Helplessness? The realization that no one is listening, and that, in any case, he has nothing to say that is worth listening to. The person displaying the symptoms of schizophrenia pretends that he is not an agent. He acts as if he were an object. Similarly, the psychiatrist diagnosing a person as a schizophrenic pretends that the patient is not an agent. He treats him as if he were an object. The so-called schizophrenic is often a person who refuses to admit that he has lived badly, is useless, guilty, or sinful. He rids himself of his bad conscience by projecting it, hence the accusing voices he hears. Only the truth, as Jesus admonished, can set him free. But what if he does not want to be set free because he prefers that others take care of him as a psychiatric invalid? The more clearly we understand schizophrenia in moral terms, the more absurd it is to speak of treating persons so diagnosed. Consider the following terms: typhoid fever, spring fever. Typhoid fever is an infectious febrile disease caused by the typhoid bacillus. Spring fever is not an illness, does not cause fever, and has no medically meaningful cause. Webster's defines it as humorous, the lazy, listless feeling that comes to persons with the first warm days of spring. Perhaps someday, dictionaries will define schizophrenia as follows: obsolete, a term formerly used to disguise the medical misinterpretation of the lazy, listless feeling, especially of adolescents and young adults, that comes over them with the first realization that they must stand on their own feet. If your circulation fails, you have ischemia. If your kidneys fail, you have uremia. If your life fails, you have schizophrenia. To cure ischemia, doctors transplant blood vessels. To cure uremia, they transplant kidneys. What should they transplant to cure schizophrenia? If our life were an organ, it might be possible for doctors to repair its malfunctioning, perhaps by replacing it with another. But our life is not a part of us. It is us. That is why no one else can fix it when it malfunctions or replace it when it fails. According to AMI, the Alliance for the Mentally Ill of New York State, schizophrenia is a pervasive brain disorder which appears to have a genetic basis. Seemingly in support of this contention, the newsletter of AMI next notes that the course of the disease is better in Nigerian and Indian villages than in New York or European cities. I dare say this assertion is not true for any real disease. Different observers may call the same person a religious fanatic, a victim of political persecution, or a paranoid schizophrenic. Each of these categories implies a mixture of description and judgment in much the same way as does calling the same glass half full or half empty. If we want to assemble an adequate sample of, say, 8-ounce glasses containing 4 ounces of liquid, we must do so by ascertaining that the volume of liquid in each is exactly 1/2 its total capacity, not by what people call them. Thus, we cannot study schizophrenia biologically unless we assemble our sample of schizophrenics according to some objective criterion. Actually, what now counts as schizophrenia is what consensus groups composed of prestigious psychiatrists choose to call schizophrenia, much as what counts as a miracle is what consensus groups composed of prestigious priests choose to call a miracle. This may satisfy the faithful, but carries no weight with the skeptic. As psychiatric doctrine has it, the typical schizophrenic patient begins to manifest symptoms of his illness during late adolescence. Nevertheless, he often lives to a ripe old age in robust health, without evidence of neurological or psychological deterioration, even in the 7th or 8th decade of his life. If schizophrenia is a brain disease, that is, plainly, a remarkable course for it to follow. The natural history of schizophrenia has engendered skepticism toward it in some psychiatrists, but not many. Few share the sentiments ably articulated by Myri Sim. For most of this century, on the basis of the most authoritative laboratory evidence of the time, schizophrenia has been variously attributed to degeneration of the interstitial cells of the testes, degeneration of the liver, and malfunctions of the kidneys, adrenals, and thyroid. The frontal lobes have also been implicated, as have vitamin deficiencies and a variety of metabolic disorders. Yet, schizophrenics had the longest expectations of life among residents of mental hospitals, and they enjoyed such rude health that they constituted the greatest security risk. You may be excused if you have concluded that all this laboratory work was done by second or third raters. Far from it. The man who provided proof of the testicular degeneration theory was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of London and was later knighted. With increasing zeal, psychiatrists assert that schizophrenia is a brain disease. Let us assume that it is. The quotation marks are intended to alert the reader to the problematic character of what it is. Would that help us cope with the problems of schizophrenia? Or would it instead help us see more clearly that the belief that schizophrenia is a brain disease conceals moral and social problems not susceptible to solution by medical research or treatment? Suppose that a person neglects his health and hygiene, perhaps even speaks about killing himself because he suffers from schizophrenia. Would that still justify incarcerating him in a mental hospital against his will? Or that he killed his wife and children, or shot the president because he suffered from schizophrenia? Would that still justify excusing his criminal behavior and incarcerating him in a mental hospital against his will? I believe that the identification of brain disorders correctable with behavioral deviations, assuming such correlations exist for what are now called mental illnesses, would increase, rather than diminish, our common-sense disposition to treat our fellow man as a responsible and respectable moral agent, deserving of human rights if he obeys the law, and of humane punishment if he does not. In the United States today, a person has the right to refuse to give blood for an AIDS test. Hence, he can, in effect, prevent others from diagnosing him as having AIDS. There is, of course, no blood test or any other physical or chemical test for schizophrenia. Giving or refusing permission for a blood test is thus irrelevant for a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Hence, a person cannot prevent others from diagnosing him as having schizophrenia. Suppose, then, that the dreams of biological psychiatrists were realized and schizophrenia were a biological disease diagnosable by means of a blood test. Would a person suspected of having schizophrenia have the right to refuse giving blood for a test for it, and hence, in effect, refuse to be diagnosed as having schizophrenia? The supreme irony about professional and popular reports concerning schizophrenia is that they invariably take for granted that, in order to cope effectively with the alleged disease, scientists must first of all discover its etiology. But this is simply not true. Indeed, from a practical, legal, political, social point of view, it is relatively unimportant what, if anything, causes schizophrenia. Inevitably, physicians and people generally are more interested in controlling some diseases and patients than others. For example, AIDS and arthritis are both diseases with clearly demonstrable bodily manifestations and somatic causes, but we are more eager to control patients with AIDS than patients with arthritis. So long as psychiatrists and jurists and people generally attribute homicide and suicide and other disturbing behaviors to schizophrenia, we will want to control patients suffering from it regardless of its cause. The idea of insanity as an alien power lurking out there, ever ready to enslave and oppress us, exemplified by schizophrenia, supports psychiatry as an ideological theory and movement of liberation. The fact that schizophrenia is a fiction and those posturing as our would-be liberators from it are the problem rather than the solution, has not impaired the credibility of the mental health movement any more than have similar failings impaired the credibility of other modem liberation movements. The human dread of disorder is evidently so powerful that it obliterates, in every generation, the memory of what ideological liberators have wrought throughout history. Indeed, it obliterates even the obvious reality of the present, denying or falsifying what modem man has done to man in the name of diagnosing and treating schizophrenia.